You know what finally pushed me over the edge? I spent an entire weekend sealing a white oak bench for my back porch, sanded it down, brushed on 3 coats of marine-grade polyurethane, let each one cure properly, did everything the can told me to do. 18 months later, the finish was peeling off in sheets, and the wood underneath was already starting to go gray and soft. 18 months. And I started wondering, how did wooden ships survive decades underwater when I can't keep a bench alive on a covered porch? That question sent me down a path I never expected. I started reading about how 18th century naval carpenters waterproofed their hulls, and what I found genuinely changed the way I think about protecting wood. These men were using a mixture of pitch, tallow, and sulfur that kept shipworms out, prevented rot, and held up for years in saltwater. No petroleum-based polymers, no fiberglass, no epoxy, just natural chemistry that actually worked with the wood instead of fighting it. Today, I'm going to walk you through exactly what they did, why it worked better than most modern sealants, and how you can adapt some of these methods in your own shop. Plus, stick around to the end because I will show you a simple 2-ingredient blend based on these old techniques that I have been using on every outdoor project since I discovered it. Let me get into it. What we are really talking about here is a waterproofing system that kept the most powerful navies in the world afloat for centuries. These were not decorative finishes. These were the difference between a ship lasting 20 years and one being eaten alive in 2. And the principles behind them are just as useful today for anyone building anything that has to survive outdoors. Let me give you some background, because once you understand the problem these shipwrights were solving, everything else makes sense. In the 1700s, the Royal Navy operated out of dockyards at Chatham, Portsmouth, and Deptford, and they had a problem that was costing them more ships than enemy cannon fire. It was called Teredo navalis, the common shipworm. It is not actually a worm. It is a saltwater clam that burrows into submerged wood and eats it from the inside out. A single infested plank could be reduced to honeycomb in under a year. And it was not just the worms. Constant immersion in salt water, tropical heat, and the endless cycle of wet and dry above the waterline meant that rot was a constant battle. These shipwrights did not have the luxury of failure. If the hull coating failed mid-ocean, men died. So they developed a waterproofing system built on a simple philosophy that I think we have completely lost in modern woodworking. Instead of sealing the wood surface with a hard shell, they saturated the wood itself with protective compounds that moved with it, repelled water from within, and could be renewed when they wore down. They treated waterproofing as chemistry, not as paint. And that distinction matters more than you might think. The foundation of their entire system was what they called paying the hull. The word pay comes from an old French term meaning to coat with pitch, and the mixture they used was remarkably effective. The base ingredient was Stockholm tar, which is pine tar distilled from the resinous stumps of Scotch pine trees. Sweden was the primary supplier, and the stuff was so valuable to the British Navy that trade agreements were negotiated specifically to secure it. To the Stockholm tar, they added tallow, which is rendered beef or mutton fat. And the third ingredient was flowers of sulfur, a fine, pearl-white sulfur powder. Here is what each one does, and why the combination works. The pine tar is the waterproof barrier. It is naturally hydrophobic, meaning it actively repels water. But unlike a polyurethane or an epoxy, it does not form a rigid film on the surface. It soaks into the wood fibers and remains slightly flexible, which means it moves with the wood as it expands and contracts through moisture cycles instead of cracking and peeling away. The tallow serves as a plasticizer. It keeps the tar coating pliable over time and prevents it from becoming brittle in cold water or baking hard in tropical sun. And the sulfur is the secret weapon. Sulfur is naturally antifungal and toxic to marine borers. Shipworms simply will not eat wood that has been saturated with sulfur compounds. The typical mixture was roughly 3 parts Stockholm tar to 1 part tallow, with sulfur added at about 1 part for every 8 parts of the total blend. They heated it in iron kettles until it was thin enough to brush or mop onto the hull planking. When I first tried a small batch of this on a piece of scrap white oak, I was stunned at how deeply it penetrated compared to any modern product I have ever used. The wood drank it in. Now, before they ever applied that pay mixture, the shipwrights had to seal the seams between hull planks. And this is where a technique called caulking comes in. The material they used was oakum, which is hemp or jute fiber that has been saturated with tar. They would take loose strands of oakum and drive them into the gaps between planks using specialized caulking irons and a wooden mallet. The irons looked like wide, blunt chisels, and the shipwrights had different sizes for different seam widths. The technique required real skill. You had to drive the oakum deep enough to fill the seam, but not so hard that you split the plank or push the fibers all the way through. The goal was a firm, springy gasket that could compress and expand as the hull worked in heavy seas. Here is why this matters for us today. Modern woodworkers reach for silicone caulk or rigid epoxy fillers when they need to seal a joint on an outdoor project. But those materials are either too flexible to stay bonded or too rigid to survive wood movement. Oakum caulking solved both problems. The tarred fiber grips the wood mechanically, moves with it, and the tar keeps it waterproof indefinitely. I have started using tarred hemp cord in the seams of outdoor planter boxes I build, and the difference in longevity compared to silicone has been dramatic. You can still buy oakum at marine supply stores, and it works exactly the way it did 300 years ago. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these shipwright methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called Secrets of the Shipyard, and it covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that most woodworkers have never seen. 150 pages of real hands-on knowledge. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. The next thing I learned about was sacrificial sheathing, and this one really changed how I think about protecting outdoor woodwork. Before copper plating became common in the late 1770s, shipwrights would nail thin softwood boards, usually fir or pine, over the tarred hull planking. These sacrificial boards were deliberately intended to be consumed. Shipworms would bore into the sheathing instead of the structural oak underneath, and when the sheathing was eaten through, the ship would be hauled out and resheathed. It was a renewable armor system. Eventually, the Royal Navy began experimenting with thin copper sheets nailed over the hull, and the results were extraordinary. Copper naturally releases ions into the surrounding water that are toxic to marine organisms, creating an anti-fouling zone without any chemical coating at all. The combination of the pay mixture underneath and copper sheathing on top made hulls nearly indestructible. Now, compare that to how most of us protect outdoor projects today. We wrap wood in fiberglass and epoxy, essentially entombing it in plastic. And when that plastic shell cracks, even a hairline crack, water gets trapped underneath with no way to escape, and the rot that follows is worse than if you had never coated it at all. The sacrificial sheathing idea translates directly to modern outdoor building. If you're building a raised bed, a dock, or a fence, consider designing the most exposed elements to be easily replaceable rather than trying to make every piece permanent. It is a smarter philosophy. This next method is the one that I think most modern woodworkers overlook entirely, and that is wood selection. 18th century shipwrights were incredibly specific about which species went where on a ship. Live oak was the preferred framing timber in American shipyards because its interlocked grain and dense heartwood made it naturally resistant to rot and shipworm penetration. White oak was used for planking because its tyloses, which are tiny cellular structures that plug the pores of the heartwood, make it virtually waterproof, even without any coating at all. Elm was chosen for underwater components like keels because it resists rot when kept permanently submerged. And teak was prized in tropical shipyards for its natural oils that repel water and insects. Compare that to what most of us do. We pick a wood species based on appearance or availability, seal it with whatever the hardware store recommends, and hope for the best. I built my first outdoor table out of red oak because I had it on hand. Red oak has open pores. It absorbs water like a sponge. No amount of sealant was going to save that table, and it did not. Choosing the right species for the right exposure is the first and most important waterproofing decision you can make, and these shipwrights knew that better than anyone. Now here is a detail that seems minor but makes an enormous difference. Every historical account I have read about paying a hull emphasizes the same thing. The mixture must be applied hot, smoking hot. They heated the pay in iron kettles until it was nearly liquid, and they applied it to the hull, while it was still hot enough to sting your hands through the brush. Here's the science behind that. When wood is coated with a hot liquid, two things happen simultaneously. First, the heat causes the air inside the wood's pore structure to expand and escape, creating a slight vacuum as it cools that actively draws the coating deeper into the grain. Second, the low viscosity of the heated mixture means it flows into microscopic crevices and capillaries that a room temperature product would simply bridge over. The result is penetration that can reach a quarter-inch or more into dense hardwood, compared to the few thousandths of an inch you get from brushing on a cold polyurethane. I tested this myself with pure pine tar on two identical pieces of white oak. One piece I coated with tar at room temperature. The other, I heated the tar until it was thin and steaming, and I also warmed the wood with a heat gun first. After 24 hours, I cut both pieces in half. The cold applied tar had barely stained the surface. The hot applied tar had visibly penetrated over 3/16 of an inch deep. That depth of penetration is why these coatings lasted. They were not sitting on top of the wood waiting to peel off. They were inside the wood, part of its structure. Let me share some patterns I have noticed over the years, things I used to do myself that these 18th century shipwrights would have shaken their heads at. The first pattern is relying on film-forming sealants for outdoor wood. Most of us reach for polyurethane, spar varnish, or epoxy because they create a visible barrier you can see and feel. But every film-forming finish will eventually crack, and when it does, it traps moisture against the wood and accelerates the very rot you were trying to prevent. The shipwrights understood that penetrating coatings are always superior to surface films for long-term water resistance. The second pattern is using rigid fillers in joints that move. I used to pack exterior joints with thickened epoxy and think I was being thorough, but wood moves, seasonally constantly. A rigid filler will crack or debond, and then you have a channel for water to enter. Oakum caulking solved this 300 years ago by being flexible, renewable, and waterproof all at once. The third pattern is choosing the wrong species for outdoor use. This is the one that cost me the most wasted effort over the years. If the wood itself is not naturally resistant to moisture, no coating in the world will protect it long enough to be worth the effort. Species selection is not an afterthought. It is the foundation of the entire waterproofing system. The fourth pattern is applying finishes cold to dry wood and expecting deep protection. Room temperature application means surface-only coverage. The old shipwrights heated both the coating and the wood whenever possible, and the difference in penetration is not subtle. It is dramatic. The fifth pattern is treating waterproofing as a one-time task. The Royal Navy scheduled regular careening, hauling ships out to scrape, inspect, and recoat the hull on a fixed cycle. They never expected any coating to last forever. Most of us seal an outdoor project once and never touch it again until it is already failing. Renewable maintenance beats permanent coatings every single time. Now, for that bonus tip, I promised at the beginning. This is the simplest and most useful thing I took away from all of this research, and I have been using it on every outdoor project for the last 3 years. Take pure pine tar, the real stuff, Stockholm tar if you can find it, and mix it 1-to-1 with boiled linseed oil. Warm the mixture gently in a double boiler until it is thin and flows easily off a brush. Do not use direct heat because linseed oil is flammable. Warm your wood with a heat gun until it is just uncomfortable to touch, roughly 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Then brush the warm mixture onto the warm wood and let it soak in. Apply 2 coats, letting the first one absorb for 24 hours before adding the second. What you get is a deep, penetrating, flexible, water-repellent finish that does not form a film, does not peel, does not crack, and can be renewed every 2 to 3 years with a single fresh coat. It will darken the wood, so this is not for a piece where you want to show off the natural color, but for fence posts, garden gates, planter boxes, outdoor tool handles, workbench tops that see wet weather. It is the best exterior wood treatment I have ever used, and it costs a fraction of what marine-grade sealants charge you for a quart. I put this on a garden gate made from white oak 3 years ago, and it still looks and feels exactly the way it did the week I finished it. That is longer than any modern sealant has ever lasted on anything I have built. Now, if this kind of traditional shipwright knowledge is something you want to keep learning, I have written a guide called Secrets of the Shipyard. It covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that have been perfected over centuries, the kind of stuff you will not find in most modern woodworking books. Scan the QR code right now or check the first link below. All right, let us continue. I will be honest with you. When I first started looking into how 18th century carpenters protected wood from water, I expected to find primitive methods that modern chemistry had long surpassed. What I found was the opposite. These shipwrights understood wood and water at a level that most modern product manufacturers either ignore or have forgotten. They chose the right species. They penetrated the wood deeply with flexible, renewable coatings. They sealed joints with materials that moved with the wood instead of fighting it. And they maintained their work on a schedule instead of expecting miracles from a single application. Every one of those principles is something you can start applying in your shop today, and I promise you, your outdoor projects will last longer because of it. Thanks for sticking with me on this one. I will see you in the next video.